Why hoarding classic Mercedes is a terrible idea. Typically when somebody who hoards classic Mercedes, like somebody who has 30, 40, 50 of them, just buys them, sticks them on a piece of property outside, forgets about them, doesn't really do anything with them after acquiring them. This is a recipe for disaster. And there are a couple of paths these cars end up as new Kias by, but this is one of them. The other two are when they get the engine swap and they get lowered and bagged and all that stuff. Instead of getting restored in the right direction, they get ruined in the wrong direction. And of course, some people just buy them and run them into the ground because they're idiots. You know, we see that a lot too. But hoarding is the most deceptive one, because you think that some of these people who buy these cars are actually going to do something with them. And so I say this as my friend Cody unhoards a bunch of Mercedes that could have been decent cars 30 years ago, but from roasting in the West Texas sun, they've turned into parts cars. There's a video that's circulating around on Facebook that I'm going to link in this description in Illinois of about 40 cars. That seems to be the magic number that have gracefully sat outside for the last, who knows, 15, 20 years going away. And this is how you make quite a few classic Mercedes disappear with one stroke of the keyboard. And if you're wondering where a lot of 123s, 116s, 124s, 126s, 201s disappear to, it's in these hoards, and the hoards are the next step before the wrecking yard. So why is this such a bad idea? We're going to look at why this is such a terrible idea and what the outcome usually is and what the economic difficulties of acquiring a hoard, or at least even one car in a hoard, usually are. So the way that the hoard starts is usually like this. You have somebody with some extra money thinking that they're going to hedge things like inflation by buying a Mercedes that is a decent car. And I've done this before. You know, I have a friend out in Orlando, and I remember going to Key Largo. I guess it'll be a funny story. We'll start with the story. I went to Key Largo on a Greyhound bus, which was extremely sketchy. And I remember the most distinct experience of this was seeing this guy that was completely strung out on methamphetamines. It was a roofer, eyeing what looked like a teenage prostitute the entire time, like a hungry wolf in winter eyes a hare or something, any kind of moving animal. And I mean, this guy was licking his lips and rubbing his hands together, and I was like, this guy's like a complete pervert, you know? And he probably, my friend Jack Rosenfeld has a pejorative word that he uses to refer to these kinds of, you know, scrawny white males who wander around at night looking for meth. But I can't say it on this channel because it's just not a nice word. But the point is, that was the most distinctive experience. So the next morning I arrived in Key Largo after the bus broke down and was delayed 100 times, which is a standard requirement of every Greyhound trip. And I picked up a 300 CD that was a completely dry, rust-free car from Arizona, but had a non-functioning alternator and a bad drive shaft support. So as soon as the drive shaft would get above road speeds of 45 miles an hour, it would be fine. But anything underneath 45 was an adventure. And that car's still sitting there 15 years later under a tarp, probably still rust-free. Maybe it's not, but that's the point. Like, this car could have easily been restored so many years ago. We're not sure about now. So what happens with these cars is they're usually purchased inexpensively as a hedge. Then the new owner says, I'm going to fix it up one day, and never gets around to it. And then after they start fixing it up, or they get halfway through it, they just leave it because another car catches their attention on Marketplace. And if you don't have a plan when you buy the car, you need to leave it for somebody who has a plan, you know, a good plan, the right plan. But you need to leave it for somebody who has a plan, because if not, then they sit for years, they start to rust, their interiors deteriorate, they get water inside, sometimes the mechanicals lock up, and you end up with what used to be a decent salvageable usable car as a parts car. Now this is a whole other can of worms, but one of the other reasons this is so dangerous is because our world is becoming oversaturated with a lot of collectible junk. Collectible cars, I'm not referring to Mercedes as collectible junk, but collectible cars, valuable crystal, jewelry, real estate that requires a lot of upkeep. Our world is just getting saturated with junk. And when people talk about like the wealth gap between first and third world countries increasing, it's because in the first world, there's so much collectible junk that it just becomes junk. It just sits and rots, And what I see is like if you could take 40 of these cars, pack them up in a boat, send them to Africa, maybe they'd have a chance. But in the United States, because we've gotten to be so picky, we only want the nicest and most perfect cars. And one of the things is to refurbish one of these cars, there's so much work involved. I mean, you could spend a year on one car, getting one car up and running. One car. Imagine you have 40, It's almost too much, That's why you have to find an individual for each car. That's generally the rule. So then what happens? Well, the person usually gets sick or dies, or they lose their storage, and everything gets removed and scrapped. That's what happens. It's the reality of it. And they get scrapped, or if you're real lucky, somebody who has a Mercedes salvage operation will come in and at least use the parts or something. And this is why it's such an issue with companies like Used Auto Services, because they take cars that were stored indoors and part them out, or cars that were from Copart that were salvageable cars instead of actually dismantling parts stores, part storage, parts hoards. And there are a lot of these parts hoards. There was one that had like 60-something cars in Birmingham, near Birmingham, Alabama. The guy died. His kids scrapped everything, There was another one years ago that I remember that had some solid cars that were stored in like lean-tos and Quonset huts and pole barns out near Davenport, Florida. And this is like in 2003 or 2004 when I had just about done with school. Gone, vanished, don't know what happened. In the hoard was everything from a 190D to a 6.9, 200D, Euromarket 220D, 1979 300 SD. I mean, a lot of great cars you don't see anymore. And the thing is, because I remember how plentiful these cars used to be when they were 20-year-old cars and how unplentiful they are now, it makes me really sad because we're not going to get these things back. So my advice is this: if you're a hoarder, start selling your cars now, because it's going to take you 15 to 20 years. It's going to take you about 15 to 20 years to do this. Anyway, if you like this video and you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing. And if you want to hone your skill set on classic Mercedes, starting with a hoard car that's real cheap is a great way to do it. Sometimes they're even free. It's a great place to start. Don't start with a nice car. Start with some junk, that nobody's going to save. Make it into a nice car again. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.